As the nation shifted to a dependence on nuclear arms, the Eisenhower administration began to rely heavily on the recently formed Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, for information. The CIA used spies to gather information abroad and began to carry out covert or secret operations to weaken or overthrow governments unfriendly to the United States. One of the CIA's first covert actions took place in the Middle East. In 1951, Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalized Iran's oil fields. That is, he placed formerly private industries, mostly owned by Great Britain, under Iranian control. Now, to protest, the British stopped buying Iranian oil. As the Iranian economy faltered due to this, the US feared that Mossadegh might turn to the Soviets for help. So in 1953, the CIA gave several $1 million to anti-Mossadegh supporters. The CIA wanted the pro-America Shah of Iran, who had recently been forced to flee, to return to power, and this plan worked. The Shah returned to power and turned over control of Iranian oil fields to Western companies. The next year, 1954, the CIA also took covert actions in Guatemala, which is a Central American country just south of Mexico. Now, Eisenhower believed that Guatemala's government had communist sympathies because it had given more than 200,000 acres of American-owned land to peasants. So in response, the CIA trained an army which invaded Guatemala. The Guatemalan army refused to defend the president, and then he resigned, and the army's leader then became dictator of the country. So let's shift back to the Soviet Union. The US and Soviet relations seemed to thaw following the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. For instance, the Soviets recognized West Germany and concluded peace treaties with Austria and Japan. However, in 1955, West Germany was allowed to rearm and join NATO, and the Soviet Union grew fearful. So it formed its own military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact, which linked the Soviet Union with several Eastern European countries. It was very similar to NATO. In 1955, Eisenhower traveled to Geneva, Switzerland to meet with Soviet leaders. There, Eisenhower put forth an open skies proposal where the US and the Soviet Union would allow flights over each other's territories to guard against surprise nuclear attacks. Now, the Soviet Union rejected this proposal, but the Spirit of Geneva, as it was called, was considered to be a step towards peace. Now let's move to Egypt. So this is 1955, the same year in which the Geneva Summit took place. And Great Britain and the United States agreed to help Egypt finance construction of a dam at Aswan on the Nile River. However, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was Egypt's head of government, tried to play the Soviets and the Americans against each other by improving relations with each one in order to get more aid. In 1956, after learning that Nasser was making deals with the Soviets, Dulles withdrew his offer of a loan. Angered, Nasser responded by nationalizing the Suez Canal, which is an Egyptian waterway that was owned by France and Great Britain. Now, the French and the British were outraged. Egyptian control of the canal also affected Israel. Nasser refused to let ships bound for Israel pass through the canal, even though the canal was supposed to be open to all nations. Israel responded by sending troops, as did Great Britain and France. The three countries seized the Mediterranean end of the canal, though the UN stepped in and stopped the fighting. And this persuaded Great Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw, and it allowed Egypt to keep control of the canal. Now, this issue in the Middle East allowed for Soviet Union prestige to rise because of its support for Egypt. And to counterbalance this development, President Eisenhower issued a warning in January 1957 that is now known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. And this said that the United States would defend the Middle East against an attack by any communist country. Even as fighting was raging in the Middle East, a revolt began in Hungary. Hungary had been dominated by the Soviet Union since the end of World War II, but the Hungarian people rose in revolt in 1956, calling for a democratic government. Hungarian communist leaders formed a new government promising free elections, denouncing the Warsaw Pact, and they demanded that all Soviet troops leave Hungary. Now, the Soviet response was swift and brutal. In November of 1956, Soviet tanks rolled into Hungary and killed approximately 30,000 Hungarians. Armed with only pistols and bottles, thousands of Hungarian freedom fighters threw up barricades in the street and fought the invaders, though they were not successful. Hungarian communist leaders were executed, Some 200,000 Hungarians fled the country, and we might want to ask ourselves, what about the Truman Doctrine that promised the idea of containment? Well, the United States did nothing to respond to this Hungarian uprising. And when the UN attempted to pass a resolution to take action, the Soviet Union would simply veto in the Security Council, and that would stop the UN from taking any action.